Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And welcome to another edition of Female First, which means we are once again joined by the wondrous, the delightful Yves. Welcome, Yves.
Thank you. I like that word, wondrous.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, I don't know if I've heard that used too often. There it is.
It's giving fantasy novel. I like that.
Well, I was thinking about as we're moving into fall, and for me, fall is my favorite season. And it just has this kind of vibe to me that feels kind of like wondrous. And I really like the atmosphere and the changing of the leaves. So it's been on my mind, perhaps. How have you been, Yves?
Good. Thinking about fall, like you said, and I was taking a hike the other day through this place that really felt like a fairyland to me because there was so much moss everywhere, like dew and just like moisture dripping off of leaves. And I was just like, I really think fairies would live here. It did feel like a wondrous place. And it's like just enough greenery and foliage, but at the same time, like there weren't leaves on a lot of the trees. So it was like this perfect harmony of like being able to see enough, but also it still felt like pretty lush. So yeah, I like fall. I'm a summer. I like spring and summer, but I'm like trying not to be my normal biased self and be like, what are the parts of fall that I actually like and can enjoy? Because to me, I go straight to it's getting colder. The days are getting shorter, which I don't like. I like sunlight. So I'm trying to see what I can like gather out of it that is positive.
I wonder if that's partly because we're in the South, because I think the same thing. And fall is so short that you don't get to see like I lived in LJ, Georgia, which is in the mountains, so right at the foothills of the mountains, and it does have a good fall peak, but it's like been short because of global warming. It's been shorter and shorter and shorter as I've grown up. But when it was there for like the full month, it was gorgeous. Red and yellows and the breeze and like less rain. It was lovely to see. But like, I wonder because we're in the South, it doesn't last as long, or it seems to, like if you blink, it's gone. It feels like it lasts 2 weeks at most. And then like it's darkness and just dead trees everywhere. So it's like, where did that go? As where like summertime, obviously, again, in the South, it seems to last a whole lot longer than anything else.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like I don't really know fall that well because we don't get those like amazing colors in Atlanta. I've seen them in other places.
Right.
But I do think too that the idea of fall and all of the different colors, it does. I can see what you mean by the wondrous thing too, Anney, because when I think of fall, I think of children's books too. Like I think of parents in children's books, like taking their kids to play in leaf piles, and the kids are wearing like, what are they called? Galoshes, like the rain boots. I don't know if that's the right word for them.
Yeah.
But I feel like I never use that word because I don't know fall well. and our climate actually isn't that rainy either. So yeah, I don't know. I see it. And I plan on spending some time in the Northeast. So hopefully I do get to see a little bit of the fall this year up there.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I'm very excited for this story, Yves, because I feel like this was a first that opened a door to like an amazing story. Like it went all over the place. I wasn't expecting a lot of it. And it's also something that Samantha and I have talked about on this show about clothes and drama caused around clothes and women wearing them. So who did you bring for us to talk about today, Yves?
So today we're going to be talking about Luisa Capetillo. And she is what Anney's talking about. She's remembered as the first woman to wear pants in Puerto Rico. That sounds like that is not in any way, that just scratches the surface of everything that she did in her life. So it's not like we're being reductionist by saying that. It's definitely one thing that happened in her story it's the thing that gets the person the movie. You know what I mean? Like it's that moment in their life that is like indicative of all of the things that they've done in their life, who they are in their life. It's a very symbolic part of her story, but it is in no way the most important part of her story. It's really just, it expresses the type of person she was. And it was also kind of a practical thing for her too. So that is what she's remembered as. She could also be considered one of the earliest feminist writers in Puerto Rico. And we'll get into that in her story.
Yeah.
You know, as insignificant as it seems about the pants, the amount of conversations we've had on this show alone, in our books, like that's really fairly significant because of the demonstrations. And this is a revolt. This is a protest that a lot of women did way back when. We talked about it with the bloomers, and then we talked about it in our own, I think we did an episode, and we also did in our book about pantsuits, about how the government, which just happened not too long ago, like in our lifetimes, about how they in Congress, women decided to protest by wearing pantsuits, which was like unheard of. Like all of these things that we talk about is such an odd conversation, and it seems so trivial, but at the same time, it was fairly bigger than what we know, and the whole like implications of it was pretty big, and it does kind of set a precedent about who these people were and what they were trying to say, and it often has a lot to do with women's rights and feminism in itself. I love that.
Yeah, I do too. And also, we haven't really, I don't think we've ever talked about a Puerto Rican woman on this show before. I might be incorrect about that, but we definitely haven't talked about a lot of them. So I'm excited that we are able to talk about somebody from Puerto Rico today, because Puerto Rico in itself has its own rich history, one that is still in flux and that still so many people are talking about. So thinking about how we're still like, and this was the 1800s to the early 1900s that we were talking about people wearing pants. And then in US Congress, we're talking about this in like the 1990s. So I think too, I mean, obviously because of Vice President Kamala Harris and everything that's happening right now in the US presidency, like there's so much friction and so much coagulation and so much electricity around this idea of like women in politics doing things. And like, I think one interesting thing about what y'all talk about on Sminty and then what we have talked about on Female First is like being able to see that from a more global perspective. And you start to like just be able to put into perspective better, like what's happening in different places at the same time. So we'll get to talk about that context too with Luisa Capetillo's story.
Yes. Well, should we get into it?
Yeah. So Luisa was born on October 28th, 1879 in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. And at the time she's born, Puerto Rico is under Spanish rule. But in 1898, the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico and Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States. So her father, Luisa's father, Luis Capetillo, was from Spain. He did various jobs, including ones in agriculture and construction. And Luisa's mother was Margarita Perón, and she was a domestic worker from France. And Luisa was their only child. And Luisa's parents, they were really influenced by like the aftermath of the French Revolution. Margarita herself was influenced by the work of George Sand, who was a woman writer who criticized marriage and like talks about lots of other things. But Luis and Margarita never got married. And like in any other story, I wouldn't really like, it feels kind of odd to say that, but it's because of this specific context, Luisa's context, and she talks about marriage in her work and relationships between couples and also women's rights are part of the things that Luisa talked about, which is why I have to just add this disclaimer. That's why I'm saying that. It's not like I actually cared whether or not they're married or like that's even that pertinent to the story beyond that point. But Luisa's father taught Luisa to read and to write and to do math. So she got kind of an outside of the home education as well, but inside of the home is where a lot of the education was happening because her parents were introducing to her introducing Luisa to these works. She's exposed to the writings of philosophers and anarchists, of people like Victor Hugo and Emile Zola and John Stuart Mill. And she spoke with her parents about workers' rights, religion, and anarcho-syndicalism, which is an anarchist philosophy that really advocates for workers taking direct action for better conditions. It's like seeking to tear down traditional organizations of authority and capitalism and organize these mass unions kind of and have civic and political life revolve around that. And I am trying to imagine these conversations that she was having with her parents, because I'm imagining this is during the time of her adolescence. Like, I don't know of any record of what those conversations were like. It's just that in the sources I've seen from the scholars and the historians who worked on uncovering her legacy have said that she was a precocious child and that her parents, because of their background, they came from Europe. And this was in the 1800s. You know, the times that they grew up in Spain and France were obviously very turbulent. And so they had clearly some sort of social and class consciousness coming over from Europe. And also, I believe they weren't wealthy. So I'm not sure if they were poor, but they weren't wealthy. And they were also already thinking about labor and thinking about their economics and their social status. And they were migrants. So I guess in my mind, these are really big topics. And it seemed like Luisa was pretty young. And I'm not saying that people who are that age can't like internalize these things, but I don't know. How do y'all feel about that? Like, were these the kinds of conversations you were having with like any adult figures who were in your life, like in your adolescent times, about like anarcho-syndicalism and like, I don't know. What do y'all think about that?
I would say I'm like I was not at that level at all, but my family was very political. My dad was a professor. So we would like over the dinner table have these debates isn't even the right word, just like discussions about it. But of course I was quite young, so I'm sure I don't know how educated I sounded or like how great the points I was making were, but we were having like political discussions when I was at least middle school, and my older brother was way more into it than me, so not the same level, but kind of.
No. Like my answer is just no. I'm like, I would still have to look up some of those words today. Let's just be very honest. We didn't talk about politics much. And because I come from a very conservative family that wasn't highly educated, it was mainly just of like, don't talk about it. Talk about Jesus only. End of story.
Yeah. I could imagine like just between the two of y'all, that's a huge range on the spectrum of the kinds of conversations that y'all were having when you were children. And I just think about it because I try to imagine the context of like someone like this who is involved in organizing and who has a political consciousness across continents, you know, and across a certain period of time. Like, how were they thinking when they were young? And like, what kinds of conversations did they have with the people who were in their lives, whether they were peers or they were like older than them? So it's interesting to see the kinds of works that she was reading and imagine those conversations, because we don't have audio of those conversations. We don't have documentation of them. So I think it's just something interesting to ponder as we think about how Luisa Capetillo, the organizer, came into being. At some point when Luisa was young, her father left and didn't come back, and her mother mostly raised her from then. And sometimes she even went to work with her mom. And this is how she met Manuel Ledesma. Manuel was the son of the leader of the Unconditional Spanish Party, which was a loyalist conservative party. And she had two children with Manuel in the late 1890s, and their names were Manuela and Gregorio. And Manuel is of a higher class than Luisa is. And there were, of course, these conceptions around gender and around relationships. And Luisa was expected to care for her children. But the children lived with Luisa's mother while Luisa kind of went back and forth between households. And someone of Manuel's stature, he was higher class. He was in this kind of uppity family that was involved in politics. And he wasn't supposed to mix with someone of the working class like Luisa, especially with the kind of arrangement that they had. And their relationship ended, but he did keep supporting the children financially. And Luisa also worked as a seamstress to support her children. So one thing that I've seen brought up in sources too is about how the children had to deal with the different like kind of political ideologies between the two of them, because Luisa was not a loyalist in the Conservative Party. And I don't really know how the children responded to that. I know that they were pulled in different directions because of their different ideologies and what they would have imagined for their futures. But I am also curious, like, about like in that moment at the time as they were growing up, how they reconciled the information that they were getting from their parents, because Manuel and Luisa weren't together, but Manuel seemed like he did stick around for Manuela and Gregorio and was still in their lives, even beyond when they separated. But yeah, Luisa starts to get into her organizing life. So she starts writing her first articles for local newspapers around 1904. She starts working in garment factories, and she goes to strikes, and she becomes involved with the Free Federation of Workers of Puerto Rico. And I'll call that the FLT from here on, because that remains in her story. But the organization followed anarcho-syndicalist principles. And Luisa also joined the Tobacco Workers Union. And she became a reader, or what was known as a lectora, in a cigar factory. And she was paid to read to people while they worked. Could you, like, that sounds like a great job. Like, I mean, just from my biased perspective, like showing up and reading to people is amazing. But like, honestly, practically, like it was really good because there were a lot of people who couldn't read. And obviously, this is a service that she like loves doing and has clearly had a background in through how her parents raised her and her education that she got in the home. And she wasn't just reading anything to them. So she would read to them while they worked. She got paid for it, but she would read things like news and political theory. And so people's consciousnesses were raising through the work that she was doing. She would be seated on this like raised platform surrounded by these workers. And she would start reading newspapers, and then she would also read chapters from novels. So if there was, like, she could like serialize a novel over time and read a novel to a person by reading chapters every time she was there. So people are learning about labor organizing around the world. They're learning philosophy while she's there, and they're also getting to enjoy fictional narratives while they're working. So Luisa also publishes articles in progressive publications like the FLT's newspaper, Unión Obrera, and folks get familiar with her work as a lectora and as a journalist. She participates in more agricultural strikes and ramps up her organizing work. So people are listening to what she's saying, they're rallying as she tries to bring farmers together and factory workers together. And she's writing and lecturing about workers' rights, about women's rights, and about collective liberation. So in 1907, she published her first book, Ensayos Libertarios. And here is part of the beginning of that book. Education is the basis of happiness for all people. Teach under the canopy of truth. Tear off the veil of ignorance and show the true light of progress, free from all rights and dogmas. practice fellowship in order to tighten the bonds that should unite humanity from one end to another, regardless of race or belief. Ignorance is the cause of the worst crimes and injustices. And that's the end of that quote. So in that book, she talks about the workers' struggles and how they're up against the greed and exploitation of these wealthy capitalists. She began traveling across Puerto Rico. She was lecturing on behalf of the FLT, and she was writing articles for labor papers. And she also edited a publication called La Mujer, which means the woman. And don't think any of the work that she edited for that publication or that publication is available to read today. But there is a lot of her other work that you can read. In 1910, she published her second book, Humanity in the Future. And in that book, she advocates for free love. She advocates for vegetarianism, health reform, education. These are things that'll come up across her work as her philosophy continues to expand and as she continues to organize. In 1911, she published My Opinion About the Freedoms, Rights, and Duties of the Woman. And some folks have considered that kind of like the first feminist treatise published in Puerto Rico, but it's definitely an early one. And she talks about sex work, she talks about religion, and she talks about sexual oppression and marriage. And she advocates for the comprehensive education of women. And that same year, 1911, she has a child with a pharmacist who happened to be married. And that child's name was Luis. And the pharmacist doesn't recognize Luis as his child, unfortunately. And Luis goes back to live with his siblings and Luis's mom. And his situation is a little different from Manuela and Gregorio's because, you know, their father was in their life. But in this case, Luis's father is not in his life. So he forms a lot of his consciousness around Luisa alone, and he gets to travel with her sometimes as well, but he does spend time with his siblings and Luisa's mom. So Luisa herself, she believed that motherhood is important, but that women's role should extend beyond the domestic sphere. So she recognizes, motherhood and how that plays a role in how people develop their consciousnesses and how they're raised and how society works, but she doesn't believe that women's work should just stop right there. And she also advocated for women's voting rights as part, though, of this larger working class agenda. So a lot of other people in Puerto Rico at the time were more so thinking about women's voting rights going to educated women, versus Luisa thought about it more, and fellow anarcho-syndicalists who were in alignment with her and her ideals, as this is something that all women should, no matter their stature, should be involved in. If we're going to use voting as a means to power, then all women should have access to voting. She started wearing pants too. So these helped her move throughout all the space. So she was traveling a lot. She was going through fields. She was going through factories. So this pants probably, like, just, as I said earlier, from a practical standpoint, made a lot of sense for her to wear. But it also may have helped her blend in better with the men who were leaders in the FLT. So there were a lot of men who were part of these organizations, and she was one of the fewer number of women who were leaders in the labor organizations. And so this helped her kind of assimilate in a way, or be like less and more conspicuous at the same time in an odd way, because she wasn't dressing like other women, but at the same time she was like blending in. So that's where the pants story starts. And you can see pictures of her wearing these outfits too, which is pretty cool. So she visited the US and Cuba in 1912, and she went to New York, she went to Tampa, Florida, and she went to Havana, Cuba. And she was moving through these intellectual and political circles and writing for local anarchist and labor papers in New York, working as a journalist. And she was working as a lectora in a cigar factory in Ybor City in Tampa. And she began writing her last book while she was there in Ybor City in 1913. And Ybor City, which is the neighborhood in Tampa, was a hub for diverse anarchists and socialists. So it wasn't like she was like one of a kind while she was there. There were a lot of people from different places who were involved in that manner of political ideology. So there were also anarchists, there were also socialists who were there, who were involved in labor organizing. There were also other lectores. Forgive my Spanish for those of y'all who speak Spanish. But yeah, who were there. They were mostly men. And that was the case in Puerto Rico as well. And that was the case here in Tampa. So it was mostly men who did this job. It was fewer women who did it. And so she was introducing these feminist ideas into the ideas they were bringing to the table, but she wasn't the only one who, it was not like something necessarily they hadn't heard before. They might not have heard her specific brand of like how she was bringing her ideology as a suffragist into it, but she was in good company, so to say. And by 1913, she published the second edition of her 1911 book, My Opinion. She continued doing her organizing work, but by 1915, she had moved to Cuba and she was working with the Anarchist Federation. And she helped sugarcane workers during a strike, and she supported a manifesto that denounced the government for trying to suppress labor uprisings. And on July 24th, 1915, in Havana, Cuba, she was arrested for what they considered dressing like a man in public, which meant that she was wearing a jacket, a tie, and a hat. So she was back in Puerto Rico by 1916. And that year, she published her fourth and her last book, Influencias de las Ideas Modernas. And there are plays, stories, and letters in this last book as well. So she helped lead strikes, walkouts, and protests now that she's back here in Puerto Rico. And of course, she gets pushback from authorities from the work that she was doing. In 1918, she was arrested in jail for what they considered inciting a riot, and she was fined, but her supporters raised the money and she got out. And from 1919 to 1920, she traveled between the Caribbean and the US. She was running a boarding house and she was participating in political debates. And by 1921, she was back in Puerto Rico, though. So she was campaigning for candidates for the Socialist Workers' Party. But at some point during all this moving around that she was doing, she got tuberculosis and she was struggling with her health. And she died in Puerto Rico on April 10th, 1922. So she did a lot in her life, even though she died when she was relatively younger. But her organizing, really crossed borders, coming from the Caribbean to the United States. And also just like her upbringing took place at a time when a lot was changing in Puerto Rico. So I think her story is very fascinating. And clearly she was also a stylish person. So I appreciate that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, she was. Those pictures, listeners, look them up.
Mm-hmm. She was fashion forward.
Mm-hmm.
She was fashion forward, but also, yeah, practical. It just made sense. There's so much I love about her story. She has a lot of great quotes, and we love quotes over here, so also go look that up, listeners. She has a lot of interesting thoughts about religion and anarchy that I thought was fascinating, because we like talking about religion here.
Yeah.
Huh. But yeah, like you said, it's the perspective of this is really useful because we are having so many of these conversations still, but seeing it from her viewpoint, similar things from her viewpoint, I think is incredibly valuable. And also, I kind of love she called her book My Opinion. Like, I know it's a longer title, but I like that it's called My Opinion. I actually really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it just feels so confident in a way, I guess. Like, because if you're getting the book, you're like saying, I want to get my opinion. It feels very
Right.
She's going to influence you with her thoughts and the way she's thought about them and written about them. I love it. I love it.
But not in an evangelizing way, though.
No.
Because it's like, I have authority, but I'm still telling you this is like from my particular viewpoint. So I'm not trying to force this down your throat. I'm just saying
Mhm.
I have a lot of these thoughts and they have great basis. And I've done a lot of work in these areas. And I have something to say about it. I'm going to publish it.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it so much.
And just thinking back about the first conversation we were having when we were talking about, did you talk about politics like this as a child? And I was like, nah. Like, so her death, she was my age. She died around my age. And looking back at what she did, I'm like, damn, I'm behind.
Oh my goodness.
But
Not
no,
this,
just 'cause
Samantha. Stop it.
just all the time. But the fact that she was such a force and such an influence on unionizing as well as labor organization, that's huge in itself, because that's still a conversation and a big need that's happening all around the world today. And the fact that it's still something contentious like that is something that we do need to talk about, especially when we're talking about Puerto Rico in itself and the history of Puerto Rico in the U.S. is not pretty. And the fact that that's still on the table in discussion, and seeing what she has done and what she has done to influence so much in feminism and, again, or unionization and all of that. That's a lot. And that is a lot she's in her short life that she has accomplished. And that's amazing to see. And I'm glad we've got those records and also the pictures.
And also the pictures. And speaking of the records, like, shout out to all the people who translated her work from Spanish to English, because if it weren't for those people, then people like me, silly Americans who can only speak English, would not be able to access her work without having like somebody else to help translate. So
Right.
To the translators who translated her work and who translate everything else to allow us to learn more about people, because I think outside of Puerto Rico, I think maybe even in Puerto Rico, it's been helpful, the work that scholars have done to uplift her legacy. But like outside of Puerto Rico, outside of the Caribbean, like the work that the scholars and historians have done to uplift her legacy, which seemingly deserved to be and was like covered as many other people we talk about on Female First have been. That the work that they were able to do to uplift it has been really helpful.
For sure.
Yes. Always appreciate translators who help us talk about important topics around the world. And we always appreciate you, Yves, for bringing people we might not have heard of and giving these stories and all of this context. So thank you so much, as always, for being here.
You're welcome. Happy to be here, per usual.
Yay. Where can the good listeners find you?
You can find me on the internet. You can just go to yvesjeffcoat.com, and then you can find all the other things from there. My name is spelled YVESJEFFCOAT. If you want to hit me up on Instagram, you can. You can go to Not Apologizing. You can also hear me on Theme, which is a podcast about Black storytelling that I co-host with Katie Mitchell, and also on many, many other episodes of Female First here on Sminty.
Yes. So go check out all of that stuff if you haven't already, listeners. And if you would like to contact us, you can. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast, or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We're on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book where, yes, we do talk about pantsuits and clothing. You can get wherever you get your books. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.